Okay, so for this chapter, chapter 12, we're talking about some features on different coastlines that you may see if you go to the beach or the ocean. So some of these you may not ever see, some of them you may see all the time, but just want to go over a few of these terms here. An atoll is essentially an island that exists in the ocean. It has a shape that kind of looks like the letter C, right? So it's, if you look kind of down above, it looks like a C, or sometimes it's an O. It's essentially a ring of land, and we'll talk about how it's formed, but briefly, it's from a volcano that as it cools, it starts to sink, and what's left at the surface is the atoll. Next term is backshore. This just refers to the shore further away from the beach. So, you know, if you go to at least here in South Carolina, if you go to a state park, you park your vehicle in a parking lot and then you have to walk out to the beach. The area between where you park your car and the actual beach is the backshore, right? So it's kind of the part that's separate from the ocean. Backwash is a term used to describe when waves come in. When they go back, that's the backwash. So they're washing back, backwash, they're washing back. Barrier Island is very common in the Southeast, especially South Carolina. I think we have about 12 of them in South Carolina. They are essentially an island that is naturally formed, and it's made out of sand, and it acts as a barrier, right? So it's separate from the mainland, the continent. So if you go to one here in South Carolina, you're in South Carolina, say in Columbia, and you drive to the coast. To get to a barrier island, you have to take a bridge usually, because the island is separate by another feature that's called a lagoon. And all a lagoon is a small body of water that separates islands from what's known as the mainland. I don't know if they have, I don't see that word on here, but it's just mainland refers to the continent. Barrier, the order is going to be a little bit different because if you can look, this is one page and this is another page. So the way it kind of splits in the chapter is a little bit different. Barrier reef is something that's very common, especially off of Australia. It's essentially a reef that is offshore and acts as a barrier. And barrier reefs and barrier islands are called barriers because they help slow down big storms. So if you look at hurricanes or things like that, when those storms are coming through, they tend to hit these islands and reefs first and lose a lot of energy. And when they lose a lot of energy, when they hit the mainland, excuse me, where a lot of people live, it's not as damaging. Baymouth bar is just, it's a small piece of sand sediment that occurs at the opening to bays. And bays are just kind of, how do you describe a bay? A bay is kind of like a pocket of ocean water. So San Francisco Bay is a really big pocket of water. There's Chesapeake Bay near Washington, D.C. Large, it's essentially a piece of the ocean that has gone in to the mainland. Just said what bays were. Beach is the sand part that you walk on right next to the ocean. It's usually, or it could be rocks, especially on the west coast of the U.S. and a lot of the like Hawaii and certain parts of Japan and Australia and New Zealand, South Africa too. They're rocky beaches. So a beach is just kind of where the land meets the ocean. That's really what a beach is. Beach nourishment, excuse me, is where you help grow the beach. In a lot of places, we'll talk about this, a lot of beaches are sand. And as the waves move, especially there's something called longshore drift that's caused by the longshore current, they will move sand. Right, so the beach may get smaller, and people that have houses or go there for vacation like to have the beach there. So It's very expensive, but a lot of people do it. Like Myrtle Beach, they do a lot of beach renourishment here. Beach scarp, kind of like a small hill on the beach, not terribly important. Berm and berm crest, again, kind of, these are small kind of hilly features on a beach. A berm is just kind of the top of the hill, right? The berm crest, the top of the hill, not terribly important. Some people call them, I don't see the word in here, but these are also called dunes. So if you ever go to a beach in South Carolina, people call them dunes. They're essentially hills of sand that are in the back shore, right? They're just hills of sand, right? And they may have plants on them, may have trees. It really depends. Breakwater is something, there are some natural ones. Yeah, there are some natural ones. They're mostly, my experience, breakwaters tend to be artificial, right? So man-made. What breakwaters are typically rock walls that are put in the ocean to slow the waves down. So if you're in a harbor with a lot of boats, when you're leaving the harbor and you go out on the ocean, you don't want a lot of strong waves. So what a lot of harbors do is they have a breakwater, right? So it as you're entering the ocean is fairly calm, right? You don't have a lot of waves coming in, right? So a breakwater kind of makes it less energy for things to go in and out. Coast just refers to the area of land that's near the ocean, and that's all a coast is. A coast includes the beaches, it includes the sand, includes the trees. Coast really is anything, any piece of land that is influenced by the ocean, right? So a coast may be 100 kilometers away from the beach, but it's still impacted by the ocean. Coastal cell, not terribly important. Coral reef, we'll talk a lot about coral reefs at the end of this class, especially with climate change. Coral reefs are these, let's see, here they are. It's essentially, they're calcium carbonate, so bone, skeletons. And when the corals grow, these physical structures, right, they're hard, physical structures act to create the structure of coral reefs. Now, when these are alive, right, the little coral polyps come out, it's a whole ecosystem. We'll talk a lot about it. But coral reefs are the structures created by coral. Delta, we'll look at some examples of deltas in class. They are areas outside where rivers meet the ocean, right? So when rivers meet the ocean, there's usually a lot of sand and sediment in the rivers. And when they meet the ocean, that sand falls out, right? When it does, it creates this kind of layer, right? It's like a fan of sand, right? We'll talk about different ones. Depositional coast, I want you to know this term. This is a coast where generally not a lot of wave energy. You still have waves, but they aren't very powerful. And as a result, you tend to have more buildup of sand, right? We talked about beach nourishment a while ago. Depositional coast is natural beach nourishment, right? The ocean is adding sand back to the beach. This is very different than what's known as an erosional coast. Typically lots of energy, sand is washed away, right? That's the difference between depositional and erosional. Drumlin, not important. Erosion, when you wash things away, you erode things, right? Like an erosional coast, you're losing sand. Estuary, super important term. Put a star next to that one. Estuary is anywhere fresh water, like rivers and lakes, meet the ocean, which is salt water, right? So you have no salt, salt, and where they meet, that meeting is an estuary. Very important. Eustatic change, I'm not going to talk about. Fjord is a type of estuary. If you've ever been to Northern Europe or like Alaska, you'll see a lot of mountains, right? And what has happened in the past is glaciers have moved through those areas and they act kind of like bulldozers, right? Like they're shoving rocks. And fjords are created when those glaciers essentially cut out. It sounds unbelievable, but the glaciers cut out these channels in the rocks and they fill with ocean. And they create what's known as a fjord estuary. And there's, we'll talk a lot about estuaries in our asynchronous class, but fjords are these very narrow channels that are carved out by glaciers. Foreshore, just the opposite of backshore, is the front of the beach. Right? Fringing reef, excuse me, is a specific type of reef, typically coral reefs, that fringe or go around typically islands, atolls, things like that. So they're just kind of like, I think of them like sprinkles, right? If you get ice cream or yogurt and you put the little, whatever sprinkles like, or chocolate chips or mochi or whatever you put on top of your yogurt or ice cream, it's the same thing, right? They kind of form this ring around it. Groin, in this context for this class is essentially a stretch of sediment, of sand. And it typically is near, depends on where you are, typically is at one end of a beach, right? A barrier island, right? So we'll look at pictures in class of barrier islands. If you look at the ends, typically one of them, depending on if the current is going north or south, you'll have a groin. So groins are kind of useful to know kind of where the currents are going. Headlands, excuse me, are referred to the headlands, but it's kind of like if you're at the beach and someone says, there's the headlands, you're really kind of looking away from the beach at the area at the start of the beach, right? It's kind of like where the old dunes are, right? Or the old beach was. Typically is the back shore, but it depends. It depends. So headlands, it's kind of it depends on where you are. So I wouldn't worry about that one. High energy coast, we talked about this a little while ago with erosional coast. High energy coast, very strong waves, washes away a lot of sediment, a lot of power, a lot of energy. Because remember, waves are carrying energy. It's energy, it's moving. Inlet is wherever the opening to the lagoon. Inlets can vary depending on what they mean. It could be a lagoon, it could be a bay. It's the opening. It's kind of how you go from the ocean into the bay, the lagoon, etc. The harbor, right? It's a general term. Lagoon, talked about this briefly. It's just a very small, typically, body of water between typically barrier islands and the mainland, right? Typically very small and very shallow. Yeah, but we'll talk about this a lot with what lives in there, and a lot of animals live in there. So it's a very important habitat. Okay, longshore bar. So these next few are all kind of related. So longshore bar, current and drift and trough, they're all kind of related. And so what I want you to know from these is when you go to the beach, there are waves typically. Many times, if you go a little bit away from the beach onto the ocean, maybe like 10, 20, 50 meters, you typically have currents that are moving not towards the beach, but along the beach. So if this is the beach, the waves are coming in like this. Longshore, they tend to move this way, right? And they tend to move sand a lot. And longshore drift just refers to that sand and the movement of sand. Sometimes that sand builds up and creates a very special type of feature that's a groin technically, but it's called a longshore bar because it's created by the longshore current. Groins they can be created a number of different ways, but a longshore bar is created by a longshore current. Now, the opposite of a bar, right? So if you're moving sand somewhere, that means you're taking sand from somewhere. That's a longshore trough, right? So you have areas where you're removing sand, moving it elsewhere. That's all that is. Low energy coast, opposite of high energy, typically is depositional, right? You're depositing sand there. Marine terrace is a very broad term. It's kind of like beach. It's just, what is a marine terrace? It's essentially the land near the ocean, the land impacted by the ocean, right? It's a lot like, it's kind of like coast, but more impacted by the ocean. Don't worry about this one. Moraine is a type of land. Don't worry about it. Partially mixed estuary. We'll talk a lot about this in class. This is typically what we have in South Carolina. And most estuaries are like this, partially mixed. You have the rivers coming in and the oceans coming in, and they mix up a little bit, partially mixed. Rip current is similar to a longshore current in some ways, but it's different in others. A rip current is essentially, if you look at this is the beach and the waves are coming in this way. A rip current is a current that goes out very strong from the beach to the ocean. So if you're swimming at the ocean and you're paddling around and this has happened to me and it's very dangerous. I'll tell you how to get out of it. If you get in a rip current, it'll take you away from the beach very quickly out to the ocean, which is kind of scary, right? Because you're swimming and you can't move anywhere. The trick to a rip current is if you get stuck in one. So if this is the beach and the rip current's taking you this way, instead of trying to swim back to shore, right? Because you're fighting the rip current, what you do is you swim along the beach. You get out of the current. You can either swim either way to get out of the current. Because if you kind of swim directly back to the beach, you're fighting that rip current and you probably won't make it. Right? So they're very strong, very powerful because water is powerful. Salt wedge estuary, we'll talk about this. It's kind of, another word would be poorly mixed estuary, right? You got essentially a very strong river like the Mississippi and the ocean, and it doesn't really mix, right? It's like a wedge. They just kind of hit each other, right? They're not mixing like partially mixed, right? They're just kind of butting up against each other. We'll talk about that in class. Sand spit, just another way to describe groin or like a bar. There's probably 30 different terms to describe sand at a beach. Probably not that important. I mean, a sand spit and a groin and a bar. And what was the other one? There's another one. Oh, where was it? Oh, I don't see it right now. But sand spit is essentially just a little piece of sand. When I say piece of sand, 10, 20, 50 meters, right, on the beach. Sandbar, kind of like a sand spit, but it's in the ocean, right? So sandbars, typically, you don't see them. So if you're walking on the beach and you're watching the waves, you don't see the sandbars. However, if it's a very low tide, like we talked about in the last class, you can walk out to the sandbar, right? It's kind of this bar, you can think of it kind of like a very, very small underwater island. If the tide is low, you can walk out to it. Now, if you do walk out to a sandbar, realize that when the tide comes back in, you're going to be in the ocean. So you better be able to swim or get back. But sandbars are cool because they oftentimes have lots of really interesting shells because no one ever goes out to them. But you do have to pay attention to the tides. All right, sea arches. There are arches that they appear to be arches. They're kind of like, I don't know, like they're created by water and wave eroding into the sides of a cliff, right? So if you look at a big cliff in California or Oregon, the water tends to erode through it. And once it erodes through it, you have this kind of hole and then an arch around it. That's all a sea arch is. The hole that is eroded is called a sea cave. Sometimes the caves go through the cliff, sometimes they don't. It depends. Sea cliff is the piece of land that was just eroded by the water to make the sea arches and the sea caves. Sea island, it seems sometimes they're just making up terms to make them up. A sea island, honestly, is any island near the sea. In South Carolina, most of the sea islands are also barrier islands. There's no difference between them. They're just an island that's at the ocean. That's all it is. Sea stacks is kind of related to what we were just talking about with sea arches and sea caves. Sometimes, see if I can do this, the arches, right? So this part's been eroded by the ocean. The arches will collapse, right? They'll collapse. And then you'll have these kind of stacks, right? These kind of columns, I guess you'd call them. Columns of rocks, right? And these are called sea stacks. Shore is where the ocean meets the beach. Sound in this context isn't like when you hear something. Sound is kind of like a different type of bay. It's kind of like, I'm trying to think of a good example of a sound right now. There's a few in the Northeast. Northeast United States. I can't remember the names, but they're just kind of, they're places very similar to bays, right? It's just another name. Swash is if you go down to the beach and you see where the water, the ocean, and the beach are meeting, and you get kind of the white foamy stuff. That's called the swash zone, right? That's all swash is. Tombolo is just another. It's a very specific type of barrier island. I don't care, you know. All a tombolo is a barrier island that's connected to the mainland, right? You don't have to drive over a bridge. It's connected. So it has like a little piece of land that you can get to it. That's all it is. Wave cut platform is essentially any piece of land that's been impacted by waves. So waves will erode and cut into the land. Then finally, well mixed estuary is where you have a river and the ocean and they mix really well, right? So it's just kind of one big thing. It's not partial, but it's very well mixed. All righty. Wow, that was a lot to go through. So that is it for tides and, coast rather. So some of these you may see, some of them not, but if you got any questions, please let me know.